Welcome to another Through the Bible edition. We are now in Genesis chapter 40. We're in the midst of talking about Joseph. And let me just say that if you've missed any of this verse-by-verse teaching through the Bible, please go back and get it, especially this section on Joseph. In chapter 37 is where we started talking about Joseph, and Joseph has to be one of my favorite characters in the whole Bible. This guy is phenomenal, what he did, and the way that God blessed him is absolutely supernatural. There's no way these things could have come to pass without God. This is just one of the greatest examples of how faithfulness to God pays off in the long run. In the short term, faithfulness to God hurt him. And many people just don't persevere. They're short-sighted and they can't see beyond the immediate rejection or problems that serving God causes. But in the long term, I guarantee you, serving God is the greatest thing you can do for your own benefit. And I believe in most cases, even in this life, we will reap if we faint not, but for certain in the next life. There are some people who may be martyred in this life and you may never see the fulfillment of God's blessing because of persecution and things. But in the next life, man, we are going to be rewarded so much for being faithful to God. We need to get a long-term vision and quit just looking at the immediate people who criticize us and come against us and things. So anyway, Joseph is just a tremendous example. So we've already talked about how Joseph was the favorite son of his father. He had these two dreams, and God showed him that his brothers were going to come bow down to him, not only his brothers, but his father and his mother. And I believe that this was more than just bowing the knee. It was them coming to where they were bowing the knee to God, who was operating through Joseph. And then in chapter 39, Joseph was sold into slavery, but he kept a great attitude. He knew that he was prosperous. He saw himself prosperous, even though in the natural, everything in the natural was bad. And he maintained it. And because of that, Potiphar saw that God was with him and that everything he did prospered. So he put him over the entire household. And then Potiphar's wife got to lusting after him and tried to entice him into committing sexual sin. And he refused to do it and said, how could I do this great wickedness and sin against God? I tell you, that 39th chapter is one of the most important chapters. God has used this to speak to me, especially when I was really young in Vietnam. And man, I just love it. This changed my life. I say this nearly every time, but you need to read the Word, not as a history book, but you need to read it about this is how God dealt with other people. In Romans 2:11, God is no respecter of persons. If He was faithful to them, He'll be faithful to you. And so when you read this, you need to read that God, as to the degree that I emulate Joseph and do what he does, I'm going to reap the way that he did. If I sow the same, I'm going to reap. And you need to see this as things that applies to you. That's the way that I read it. And I tell you, this is just, I told some of my staff, if this doesn't light your fire, your wood is wet. Something's wrong with you if this doesn't speak to you. God is wanting to speak to you through these scriptures. So Genesis chapter 40, verse 1, and it came to pass after these things, talking about after he had been thrown in prison, unjustly accused of having sexual relationships with his master's wife. He was innocent, but he was put into prison, and the keeper of the prison saw that God was with him, and so he put everything in the prison under his hand. Anything that happened, Joseph was in charge of it. He might have been in prison, but he was at the top of the prison. He was the one running the whole thing. So after these things, the butler and the baker, that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker was offended their lord, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers, and he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them. Notice talking about Joseph served them. Again, most people that would have been in a situation like this where they had been rejected by their brothers, nearly killed, then sold into slavery, and then lied about and put in prison, most people would have they'd have given up. What's the use? What good does it do me to try and live a proper life and serve God? But no, Joseph was still serving God. Joseph still knew that the pit wasn't going to be his final resting place. There was nothing in the natural that proved it, but he had 2 dreams, and I believe he knew it, and because of it, he was serving these people. You know, a person who's just depressed and defeated, you aren't serving anybody else. You're waiting on everybody to serve you. You're totally self-centered. You're totally looking at yourself. Again, I'm not trying to be mean to anybody. I'm trying to encourage you that, yes, we all have problems happen. You know, if I was to tell you some of the things that have happened in my life, I could get people pitying me. I could have people cry. I had Paul Harvey, who he's been dead and gone now for a number of years, but at one time he had probably the largest news broadcast in the world. It went around the world. And he got on his radio program. He came on around noon every day for 30 minutes and he gave news. And I made his news program. And he said, this is the worst thing that I think I have ever heard in my life. And then he talked about Jamie and me and what happened to us. And I had people in foreign countries that heard this. I've had some bad things happen to me. I'm not going to tell you what it was, but I've had some bad things happen to me. And you know what? I'm still vertical, and I'm still praising God, and I'm still thankful. Again, I'm not trying to say that you haven't had problems, but I'm saying that what God has done and what He has provided for us is infinitely greater than whatever has happened to you. And some of you may disagree with that, and that's the reason that you're sitting there moping around. It's because you think your problem is worse than anybody else. It says in 1 Corinthians 10:13, it says, there is no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. That means that it's just everybody's experiencing the same thing. Same content, just a different wrapper, a different bow, but all of us have bad things happen to us. And it says, but God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation make a way to escape that you may be able to bear it. So even though I'm saying that I know many of you have had terrible things happen to you, God has provided a way of escape for every single person. You do not have to let the things that happen to you destroy you. And you can see that with Joseph. Here he is in prison after all these terrible things have happened, and he's ministering to other people. He's not just sitting there thinking about his own problems and depressed and discouraged. He's ministering to people. He's in a prison, and yet he's making the best of that situation. And in verse 5, it says that they dreamed a dream, talking about the butler and the baker. They dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. You know, to me, this is, again, a tremendous indication of who Joseph was and how God was using him. Because these guys were in prison. Did you know our prisons? I go into prisons and I minister in prisons. I was in one not too long ago, and today most prisoners have a television screen. They got an internet connection. They have all of these things. And I'm not saying it's good, but compared to the prison that these guys were in, they didn't have television, they didn't have internet, they didn't have all of these things that prisoners today have. This was a bad situation. And so you go in, and if you were to walk into a prison in Egypt in Joseph's day, and you saw somebody sad, you wouldn't think that would be unusual. They're in prison. And you would think that, man, this is probably the way it is every single day. But in Joseph's prison, it was unusual to see somebody who was sad. So subtly, if you think about it, this is a tremendous compliment to Joseph. Joseph was ruling over that prison. He was serving the people, is what it says. And he ministered to them so much that it was unusual to see them sad. These people possibly were treated better in prison by Joseph than they had ever been treated outside of prison. Again, this is subtle, and if you just read it and don't think about it, you'll miss this, but this is a tremendous compliment to Joseph and the way that he was ministering to the people that were under his charge in the prison, so much so that it was unusual to see somebody who was sad. And so in verse 7, he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of the Lord's house, saying, wherefore look ye so sadly today? Most people would go, duh, we're in prison. But again, that was unusual for Joseph's prison. In verse 8, they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. In other words, Joseph, he had had dreams. God interpreted them to him. And I believe that it was those two dreams, the vision that God had given him, that kept him going all of these years. And so Joseph was well versed in dreams and in understanding dreams. It's possible that he had many other dreams beside this, but he was giving God the credit and saying, God can give you an interpretation. Tell me what your dream is. And so in verse 9 it says, The chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, In my dream, behold, a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, This is the interpretation of it. Again, this is inspired. You know, if I hadn't read this in Scripture and read what the interpretation was, I'm not sure that I'd have come up with this, but this was inspired by God. So Joseph said unto him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head and restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand, and after the former manner when thou wast his butler. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. And so this is the closest out of all of these scriptures from chapter 37 through chapter 50. This is the closest you will ever come to hearing a gripe come out of Joseph. And personally, I don't believe this was a gripe. I just believe that he recognized that maybe this is the way that God was going to promote him and put him into this position that these dreams had given him. And I believe he was just like planting a seed and say, remember me, think about me. So again, some people would interpret this as griping and complaining, but that would be so inconsistent with a person who is serving the people, and that it was unusual for the people under his charge to be sad. That doesn't even fit with a person who's a griper and a complainer. So I don't believe that this was a gripe and a complaint. He may have recognized that this is the avenue that God is going to use to get me out of this place and to start seeing all of these dreams that he had given him come to pass. So in verse 16 it says, When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. Before I get into his dream, let me just point out how miraculous all of this is. How miraculous it is that Joseph, the favorite son of a man living in the land of Canaan, which was hundreds and hundreds of miles away from this place, that Joseph wound up in this place, and how miraculous it was that the butler and the baker wound up in this same place, and how miraculous it was that they both dreamed a dream separate from each other in the same night, and how miraculous it was that the positive interpretation was given first. You know, if he would have interpreted the baker's interpretation first, it's possible that the butler would have never told him his dream, because, man, this was a terrible interpretation that came for the baker. And so the order that the dreams were spoken, and then the order that Joseph interpreted them, there was all of these things that everything had to line up just perfectly to make this situation work. And that makes me think that this is just absolutely providential. It's absolutely God that worked all these things together. And another thing that, I learned through this is that in the same way as this worked 4,000 years ago like this, did you know God can work everything together? I was just visiting with some people yesterday. I'm not going to take time to go into it, but we were just talking about how good God has been and all the miracles, the people that God has brought to me. It is phenomenal. I'm not smart enough. I couldn't have figured this out. I didn't make these things happen. It's God. God's working in all of our lives much, much, much more than what I think any of us recognize. But you've got to be in this positive attitude in order to benefit from it. if Joseph would have been here and if everything would have been set up just right, but if Joseph would have been moping around and so depressed and so discouraged that he wasn't believing that God could use him, this would have just been wasted time. Boy, there's so many great things to learn out of this. So the butler, or the baker, began to start giving his dream. And he said, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. And, I've thought about this, and apparently these baskets in his dream were stacked one on top of the other, because it says in the 17th verse, it says, and in the uppermost basket there was all manner of bakements for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And in verse 18, and Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. And yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. And it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Man, that is amazing. And again, Joseph, this says something about Joseph, that even though Joseph was this person who served God and people could see the blessing of God on him, and they just entrusted everything to his hand because he was such a faithful person, Joseph was also faithful to God, and he did not just say things that people wanted to hear. He interpreted this dream. I mean, this was a terrible interpretation, but it was all the truth. And it happened just exactly the way that he said. It was only 3 days. This was a very specific prophecy. Some people will give prophecies, but they're so generic that anyway, you could interpret it and make it come to pass. But this was specific. In 3 days, you're going to see all of these things come to pass, and it came to pass just exactly the way that he prophesied. And so the butler was restored to his butlership, and there he was in the very presence of Pharaoh. And yet, it says in the 23rd verse, yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. Man, that is amazing. And again, you could look at these things as a cascading effect, as a snowballing effect. Some people might be able to survive having family members hate you. But if you survive that, they wouldn't survive them hating you to such a degree that they sold you into slavery. And so here you are on an auction block, and you had been the favorite son, now you are a slave. They wouldn't have been able to survive the indignity of that, but Joseph did. And then he operated in integrity, and the master's wife, he refused to compromise and yet got punished for it and put into prison. Now here he is serving these people in prison. Very few people would have survived all of these things, but if they had done this, and the Bible doesn't make it exactly clear how long a period of time this was. It was a total of 13 years from the time that he had his dreams in Genesis 37:2 to when he saw them beginning to come to pass. And he saw the first positive thing in Genesis chapter 42. So it was 13 years. We don't know how much of that time was spent in Potiphar's house, but it appears that it was at least 2 years in prison. It could have been 3, 4, 5 years in prison, but at least 2 years in prison after this, that the butler just forgot him. And if you had survived all of those other things, and here you see somebody that you prophesied to, God used you to minister to them, and here they are exalted to the highest position in the land. They're still a slave, but they are serving the Pharaoh, and the people that you minister to prosper, but you don't prosper, you are still in prison. Not very many people could handle that. I remember people that I've ministered to, and that they received a touch from the Lord through me, and then they just took off and their ministry grew and surpassed mine like I was going in reverse. And you know what? I'll tell you, I had to deal with my own pride over that thing. Praise God. I kept my attitude straight, but it was something I had to deal with. I can imagine that Joseph, this was a temptation to him to see all of these things happen, and even people he ministers to prosper, and yet here he is still stuck in prison. But praise God, The 42nd chapter is coming. We are now through with the 41st chapter, but in the 42nd chapter is when Joseph finally begins to start seeing the blessing of God manifesting in a way that anybody could see it. So we're now through with the 41st chapter, the 40th chapter. It was the 40th chapter I just finished, and that means that we have 1,149 chapters to go.